Yeah, I live in a very, very red area.
That's a diplomatic way of saying you live amongst the Republicans. Have
Yes.
you noticed a bipartisan slant in fake news yourself?
I haven't, but a lot of that could possibly be because most of the Republicans I'm friends with are my family, and most of them don't do any sort of fact check. They will share anything that sounds like something that might possibly align with what they've convinced themselves that they believe.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of my more liberal friends are attorneys or political science majors who are taught to fact check things before they share it along.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it seems more like Republicans are willing to share the fake news and just believe anything that they read. But that just could be because of I'm a liberal black sheep in a very, very, very red state and a very red family.
It could be an education issue too, couldn't it?
Yeah.
It could be. I also wonder if it doesn't have something to do with like this is probably my own friend circle, but age. In my experience, older people tend to share more fake news and to be less news savvy.
I think part of it is because they grew up in a time where the news was more reliable.
Mm-hmm.
That I mean, there were more standards before you wrote something, so they're more likely to believe what
That's a
they see written.
yeah, that's a good point.
But this is an area where we can make a difference. So when it's something that's age-based, let's say, pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter, my mom used to regularly forward emails of news stories to my brother and to me. And so frequently we would send her back a link to the Snopes page saying, no, this is false, that
Mm-hmm.
she has since gotten much better at fact checking for herself. And, she no longer sends us those kind of stories, and she's certainly not posting those sorts of things on Facebook. And so, yes, there are a lot of places where it's very hard to sort of reach across the political divide. It's very hard to sort of, you know, uh, help people, and sort of understand other sides of issues. But at a very simple level, there are things you can potentially do to people who already like you and trust you to sort of
Mm-hmm.
say, hey, here's a place where you can check out. Don't trust me that this isn't true, but here's a website where everything they do is aimed at trying to figure out what's true and what's fake.
I want to push back on something, though. Just the notion that the news, quote unquote, is less reliable today. I don't think that's true at all. The news is just as reliable as it's ever been. There's just more of it. There's more shit out there that, so it's like NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, uh, NPR. I've seen people attacking NPR as somehow being unreliable as a news source and slanted. I'm boggled by that. It's anyway. No, the news is just as reliable as it's ever been. Journalists have basically maintained the same practices for the past 100 years. Okay, it's just that there's more of it. Now there is a Breitbart and an Infowars and a Drudge Report and whatever the nut job factions are on the left side of the spectrum too, and people just treat it as the same. Well, yeah, sure, Breitbart is not reliable, but it's not news. It's not to be evaluated on the same level as something like CBS. It would be foolish to do so.
Well,
and so I'm just really reticent to say the news is less reliable because you're kind of buying into the narrative that somehow journalism as an institution is somehow bankrupt or is somehow diminished, and it's not. It's absolutely not.
Yeah, I wonder who the people are who are writing for a site like Breitbart, because I can't imagine that they are trained journalists. I went to Northwestern University many, many, many years ago, and a lot of my friends were journalism majors at the Medill School of Journalism there, and their training was so rigorous that you could get something called a Medill F. And a Medill F was something you got on a story if there was even a single fact wrong. If somebody's name was spelled wrong, it was an automatic F on that paper that you turned in. You know, I mean, that's sort of mind-boggling now to think about. But, you know, people who are actually trained as journalists, I think, still have this sense of pride in their work and wanting to do a good job getting the facts. And so I can't fathom that people who are trained that way would then go work for Breitbart. I mean, clearly some of those people are working for Fox News. You know, I don't know what to think about that.
It's interesting. I actually met a Fox News journalist years and years ago, 2006, I want to say. And she was awesome. She was like very neutral. She was friends with my very liberal professor. I don't know much about her political orientation, but she seemed, you know, like the sort of person who would not be a Trumpist. And she said that she, you know, like this was a time when Fox News was starting to really sort of be known as just conservative propaganda. And she was like, well, I'm trying my best to do really good, fair journalism there. So I think that at Fox, there probably are journalists who are well-trained people who are intelligent and educated and really do want to get to the truth of a story. I just don't know if they're the ones who are getting their message out.
They're not elevated, you know,
Yeah.
to the public, you know, sort of speaking roles, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think happens, you know, and so at the beginning of when Fox News started to move to the right, you know, there is just so much to cover that some of this is a matter of, yes, being totally fake, like a Breitbart or an InfoWars might decide to do, but some of it is a matter of just choosing what to highlight. So, like earlier when we said that Fox News this morning, instead of talking about the indictments, was talking about, like, cheeseburger emojis or something, like, they're not actually lying, necessarily. I'm not saying that never goes on at Fox News, but you don't have to lie to just not cover things. And if the only news source someone is looking at is your news source, and you're not covering the really big stories, they're just not ever going to hear it. And so it's sort of, you know, lie by omission rather than sort of directly misleading your public.
I think that's a really good point about lying by omission, and I think that comes back to something that I think has really exacerbated the rise of fake news, which is the curation of news. The idea that now, because there are so many different targeted news sources, you've got your super liberal news sources, your sort of liberal news sources, your super conservative news sources, your like Trumpist paranoid news sources, that you can go through life with a news source that curates news that you want to hear so that you never have to encounter news that might challenge your worldview. I think that has been really responsible not only for the rise of fake news, but for a lot of the intense partisan polarization that we've seen in this country. When my parents were growing up, there were news sources that were more conservative and there were news sources that were more liberal, but many news sources were general interest intermediaries. They carried opinion columns from conservative and liberal viewpoints, but they carried columns from both conservative and liberal viewpoints. And a lot of people would read more than one newspaper. In order to get all the news that there was, you had to go to different sources. And now there are people who get all their news from Fox News because that's what they like. And Fox News caters to what they want to hear. So I think that that's a really good point about sort of the sins of omission, because I mean, news organizations can get away with that because there are a lot of people who are getting their news only from that news source.
I want to say, too, you know, I mentioned before opinion columns being treated as news. I think a lot of cable televised news is not news. It's analysis. You know, the formats of these shows are two or three people, their giant heads on the screen, sort of yelling at each other about things. And they're not actually delivering facts. They're spinning facts. You know, they're putting glosses on facts. And so people are treating a talking head show as a news source when that's not what that is, right? But apparently those things are the most popular things that you can watch. You know, that's what actually draws ratings. People are drawn to the Megyn Kelly or the Tucker Carlson or the, you know, whoever, right? And that's who they want to see. They don't want facts. They want, you know, a personality sort of filtering, occasionally dropping fact-like nuggets into a general sort of worldview statement. Like, that's what people tune into. So it's like what you say, things that are confirming of their worldview, but they're not actually consuming news, you know? They're consuming opinion. It's not a column, it's like an opinion rant, essentially. You know, it's like, what rant should I watch today? And you see it on, you know, Facebook shared things. The headlines that people often share, like, this person destroys this argument. You know, this person issues a brutal takedown of that thing. It's like, wait, is that news?
I posted something like that today.
I know. But are brutal takedowns and destructions what we're tuning in to learn about? So I think your best bet is just to not watch cable news at all, whether it's Fox News or NBC, and try to stick to print, personally. That's what I do anyway. It's also because emotionally I can't stand actually looking or listening to any of a certain group of people in politics today.
Hey, that's a great place to just plug. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but if you haven't gotten it, there's a great Chrome extension called Make America Kittens Again, and it makes it so you don't have to see President Trump's picture, but you can still read all the news. So the news, actual print, is not interrupted, but actual pictures of the president's face are replaced by kittens, so that you don't have to look at his face, but you can read all about him. Very useful.
Do you use it?
I do use it, and let me tell you, it makes the CNN experience so much more joyful. I don't have that like initial like cringe reaction anymore. I can just read about what happened without looking at Donald Trump's face. It's fantastic. But that sort of goes into another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is how is the best way to consume real news? Matthew, you said, you know, sort of avoiding all cable television news and sticking to print. What are some other strategies that people have for finding real news? Well, sort of avoiding fake.
Personally, when I say print, what I mean is I read news entirely on my phone. I have Microsoft has a news aggregator called MSN News, and it's got a list of sources. So it pulls from AP, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, and then it's got some other sources, you know, like The Hill, The Blaze, you know, like, so you can tailor it to give you a slightly more liberal or a slightly more conservative gloss. But they also, the great thing about this particular app is that you get New York Times and Washington Post straight up news articles, and with no paywall. So I try to read the national sources, nationally respected sources, in print, on my phone, you know, and if there's a big thing that's happening, I try to read 2 or 3 different, you know, straight up. Look, you can trust AP. You can trust Reuters. I mean, that's just the way it is. That's the reality. The reality is that those sources are not fake. They have reputations, they have standards, you know. So, yeah, if you want to know how to try to pursue this all-print lifestyle, when I say print, I use the term loosely, you know, all written lifestyle, my suggestion is to go with a news app that pulls from those reputable sources, and also never watch video of any kind.
I follow New York Times and Washington Post on Facebook, and so that's where I see a lot of my news stories. You know, and I'm fairly good at discerning what's news and what's opinion piece. I still read the opinion pieces, but I note them where I see them. I also read Politico, which is at least somewhat centrist. So that's the majority of where I get news when I